Hello and welcome to the Palladium Podcast, Episode 6. I'm your host, Jonah Bennett, Editor-in-Chief of Palladium Magazine, and we're joined by...
I'm Tivy, Editor of Palladium.
I'm Ash Milton, Managing Editor.
And we're also joined by Matt Ellison, the author of one of our recent pieces called The German Strategic Mastermind Behind America's Post-War Order. It's a fantastic article. You can follow him on Twitter at MG Ellison. But before we go any further, I just want to go through the reader mailbag this week and do our usual question of the week. So this week, the question is not going to be answered by the editors. It's going to be answered by Matt solely. And the reason for that is because we have a couple highly bespoke mason jars of water here. And one of them is filled with disgusting estrogenic tap water. And the other is incredibly tasty and highly purified water
From the Berkey filter.
From the Berkey filter. Probably it's just incredible water, and we're gonna see if Matt has the skills to see which is which. So why don't you take a taste now and
thank you for having me, guys. I didn't know that I was gonna have this honor bestowed on me.
Just do what you can. Just do what
All
you
right.
can.
Okay. So.
Having personally tasted the Berkey water, I can attest that my muscles were stronger and my brain was bigger, and I felt like a new man.
Go for it.
Okay, so this is jar. This is
This is jar B. This is jar B.
Oh, jar B.
That's jar A.
Okay, so should I start with jar A?
You can start with whatever jar you want.
Okay, we'll start with jar A. We'll do it in the proper order.
Okay.
Okay.
Does it smell funny?
Okay, how does it taste?
It tastes good. Tastes like water.
Yeah.
Right, what
Pretty
about the other
normal.
one?
Yeah.
Okay, the second one tasted much more like normal tap water than the first one. So but I want to be sure though. So
I mean, there's no real rush here. There's no real rush.
The suspense is killing me, guys.
yeah. I'm gonna go with the first one. The A is the bespoke.
I'm sorry, that's incorrect. Jar B was the highly purified bespoke water. I'm sorry, we're gonna end the podcast right here.
This is what happens when you.
Yeah, I'm gonna show
This is what
myself
happens
out.
when you're marinated for years in horrific sewage water.
That's enough of that. That was the question of the week.
I thought I had a future as a water sommelier, but clearly once this gets out,
It's all over.
my career is over.
That's it. All right, now we're gonna move on to discussing Matt's article. So Matt, why don't you just give us a brief overview of the article and what led you to find Gustav Hilger's work in the first place, given that when you started looking into him, he didn't even have a Wikipedia page.
Yeah, sure. Well, again, thanks for having me, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to publish this piece. I think. So Gustav Hilger is this interesting figure of the kind of the middle of the 20th century, at the kind of the epicenter of German, U.S. and Soviet relations, which obviously were kind of pivotal into kind of shaping.
Yeah, just a little bit important,
Yeah, it's shaping like international affairs during the period, and Well, so do you want me to give you first like an overview of the article, or just I guess I can.
Sure.
How'd you get onto the topic?
Yeah, I can get to this question of how I got onto it. I was very interested in this idea of history and memory and how our conception of the past kind of deviates from what actually happened, especially in the realm of like foreign policy. There's this great book about France that's called the Vici Syndrome, and it's kind of about how French national identity was kind of artificially reconstructed by de Gaulle and people around him after the end of the Second World War to kind of be along the lines of like the French liberated themselves and kind of these kind of myths of a kind of continuous French identity that kind of transcended Vici, and Vici was just kind of this bump in the road of like the great French identity. So I was interested in applying some of that that kind of method to the American context, and what struck me was how Nazi officials had been kind of captured or variously like protected and brought to the United States after the end of the Second World War.
Like Operation Paperclip.
Right, like Operation Paperclip. But I was interested in kind of really getting more into the nitty-gritty of how that happened and kind of how it cohered or discohered with our national kind of mythological history of the kind of post-war period. And so actually thanks to a kind of late 1990s congressional effort called the like Nazi War Crimes Records Act or something like that in the mid 90s, there's mandatory declassification of a lot of kind of the more sensitive documents regarding people like Dr. Gustav Hilger and kind of their role with regard to the U.S. government after the war. So for instance, in Hilger's, so I literally just started going through at the National Archives the files that they had on that were released. They kind of have a series of name files that were released about people, like hundreds of Germans that were kind of considered to be, you know, persons of interest as far as war crimes, and then kind of the connections with Americans. So Hilger was one of them, and he was the most interesting to me just because of how once I start looking through his file and then also looking at some other kind of secondary sources that mentioned him, I realized that he was this fascinating figure, like I say, at the center of U.S., Soviet, and German relations. I mean, I write in the article that he was probably the only person to personally know Joseph Stalin, Adolf Hitler, and Konrad Adenauer, and he also happened to know George Kennan, and yet like he's almost unheard of, especially outside of Germany. So if for no other reason than kind of his central role in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, I think he's an important figure. But then when you kind of consider the context in which he was brought to the U.S. after the war, and just what informal connections he has. I mean, I know we titled the piece "The German Strategic Mastermind Behind the Post-War Order." I don't know that such a strong case can really be made definitively, but I do think, you know, he played a role in kind of shaping the big politics of the period, and he's still an important figure that people should know about.
So what this sort of gets us to the article itself. Like, what was the thesis of the article? What were you trying to get at with that? Where, like, let's just go through that just so we have some background of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, so the thesis of the article is that it's kind of at its core, it's this history essay about Hilger and how he was brought to the US after the end of the war, and also his own kind of backstory and how that figured in the kind of the statecraft and the politics. But the essay is kind of the article more broadly is about American foreign policy and the kind of the history there, and I was trying to show how the statecraft and ideology work in American foreign relations, and how it seems to have kind of changed significantly over time. That there was at one point much stronger traditions of statecraft in American foreign relations, probably from the period around the Second World War to maybe into the early 70s, and then since the 70s that has kind of declined, and then after the Cold War it's kind of declined even further.
If I can just jump in here, I think the thing that jumped out at me reading this piece was looking at these three powers, America, Germany, the Soviet Union, that are loggerheads with each other, they're enemies, and yet these diplomatic institutions are so intertwined with each other that even through the war and through the start of this Cold War, they were able, individuals, right, were able to assist each other in getting extracted from enemy territory, in coming over and starting new lives. And it goes into the building of the liberal order when you start asking these questions about how were people able to create this new set of institutions right after the war. And there's a lot of historical questions that can be asked. But on the personal level, I think what gets missed out or underemphasized is the fact that the people building this order all knew each other on this very personal level. And the description you gave in the piece about, the sort of, I forget the word you use, but this getaway that they had where they would all meet with each other and talk in private, the dacha.
Yeah, the dacha crowd.
And, when you come to after the war, and you can see it in the U.S. administrations following World War II, several of them in succession, even up to Eisenhower. These are people who not only fought together, but actually, in some cases, helped to govern countries in the aftermath of the war during the rebuilding process. And by the time that they rise to the top of domestic U.S. politics, they not only know each other, but they have the sort of extensive experience and a network that's spanning the world. And the obvious conclusion in terms of a question that has to be asked is, when that network stops existing, can the institutions that were created really continue in the same way? I think that was really what I read as the interesting thesis at the core of the piece there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the strains that runs through the whole history of kind of the group that we're talking about, and also the consequences of such a group not playing the central role in U.S. foreign policy making.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the Dacha House, where a lot of this strategy was defined?
And that was in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, so the story really with Hilger and the Americans really starts at a dacha outside of Moscow, and so these are kind of like almost like log cabins in Russia that are kind of weekend getaways, or almost like summer house type situations. And when they reopened the U.S. embassy in Russia, which was the first time that they had an embassy to the Soviet Union in the early 1930s, a bunch of diplomats at the U.S. embassy rented a dacha there, and kind of there's this core group around Charles Thayer, Charles Bolin, George Kennan, Carmel Offee, and the ambassador William Bullitt. And so they create what in their memoirs and in papers, and some refer to as the dacha crowd, but it includes other Western diplomats, especially Brits and Germans, such as from the British, Fitzroy MacLean, who is considered one of the inspirations for Ian Fleming's James Bond. From the Germans, there was Hans Herwart von Bittenfeld, who is kind of more well known. I think he also is well known for having maybe played a role in one of the plots to assassinate Hitler, but also for having spied for the Americans during the 30s in Russia. And then, of course, among them was also Gustav Hilger, who was kind of considered to be this like encyclopedia of all things Russia and Soviet. He was himself born in Russia to German parents in the 1880s, and Stalin supposedly said of him that German heads of state and German ambassadors to Moscow came and went, but Gustav Hilger remained. And so he was kind of this kind of like figure of basically Western, specifically German institutional knowledge about the Soviet Union, that was kind of built up over a lifetime of living in first Imperial Russia, and then in the Soviet Union, and also his unique role as a German diplomat gave him access to the centers of power and to people like Stalin and Molotov that like were kind of inaccessible to a lot of even journalists or ordinary, certainly to ordinary Soviets.
Mm-hmm.
So the Dachauer kind of functioned as this kind of, I don't want to say secret society because there was nothing really especially secret about it, but they kind of describe this society of connections.
Yeah, like one of the things you mentioned in the piece that I found really interesting that would be interesting to hear more about is like the people having this idea that there was only certain people sort of admitted into this dacha crowd, like that they had to make sure that someone was like very trustworthy before they were sort of like part of the crowd.
That's something that Herwart writes in his memoirs. He doesn't really explain that too much. I mean, I think there's clearly this sense in which the dacha crowd is this like outlet for, I think in the words of one of the authors, like beleaguered Western diplomats, so
Mm-hmm.
it's a place where they can let their hair down when
Right.
they're in this kind of hostile climate of behind the Iron Curtain, or actually this predates the Iron Curtain, but in the Soviet sphere, right?
Mhm.
So they're kind of deep in Russia. They're constantly being like surveilled by secret police and Russian and Soviet KGB. So this is like a way for them to kind of let their hair down. I think that's really what the fears were about, and why
Right.
and why there's like this vetting involved. Also, there's all kinds of like intrigue as far as various like sordid I think sort of details. I think it's described as kind of a carnivalesque atmosphere in 1930s Moscow. So there's more. I think there's still more that probably hasn't been kind of revealed about that whole atmosphere.
Right.
It's funny though because that term carnivalesque, I think it gets to the heart of how people in general, but I think especially Westerners, see this, let's call it secretive atmosphere in which some of politics takes place, that it's kind of sordid and you don't really want this happening. But I don't know if that's true. And I think in the context of this piece, we actually see some of why that might not be true. Because if we assume that all politics, all political connection making should be done in public, in the open, and under public scrutiny, well, we have to think about the fact that in public, people are generally acting in a different way, and specifically, they often want to win over a crowd. They also don't want to make mistakes, and so in public, people will be more risk averse.
Well, it's not just domestic reactions, but it's kind of odd to reveal your private strategic deliberations to your opponents.
Yeah, like that's the
As
thing. Is
foreign
like
states.
politics inherently involves opponents, both domestic and foreign. And so like you need to have this secrecy within diplomacy. And I think this is something that you touch on in the piece, is like the sort of place for like the diplomatic and statecraft machine to have like a different internal view than what they're talking about publicly.
Yeah, and specifically spaces where it's permitted to speak more openly and also to make mistakes, because that's where these long-term connections can be built. And I think, as we see in the piece here, those connections are actually, in a certain sense, a public good, because if you have a governing class, or in this case a diplomatic corps, that has very strong personal connections that have been forged in these sorts of environments, that actually enables them to do quite incredible work, such as bringing over, personnel of an enemy power and then using their talents to build up your own country.
Right. And I would just add that this is something I thought about in the context of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, which are back in the news. Of course, like the big WikiLeaks, one of the big WikiLeaks releases was of U.S. diplomatic cables, right? And so
Right, yeah.
it kind of gets right at the heart of this question of diplomatic, state secrets and what role diplomatic secrecy has in a liberal society or in a democratic society, and there's almost an implicit narrative in kind of the media discussion around WikiLeaks that it's good to have transparency into diplomatic process, when to Ash's point, I don't think anyone would say necessarily that we want all of politics to be shrouded behind a veil of secrecy, but at the same time you need to have a degree of secrecy to have flexibility on negotiations, say with people who don't want to be necessarily have it in the newspaper the next day how much they were willing to concede in a negotiated process. There's this kind of old diplomatic notion that nothing's been decided until everything's been decided, just for this particular reason, that if you have people kind of going around saying, oh well, the other day the Americans were willing to concede to X, Y, and Z, well then it affects their ability to make that concession or to actually kind of deliver on it.
Yeah, and coming back to the domestic politics angle and the WikiLeaks stuff, you see a lot of people always calling for transparency, right? Calling for more transparency in the official processes or whatever, more transparency from the diplomatic stuff. That's what kind of the WikiLeaks kind of represents, and actually has a lot of support among other factions. I think sort of what's going on there is there's sort of people who are not quite at the center, not quite at the center of power. They want to disable the central power in a way, and making it more transparent makes them more able to outmaneuver it, right? And in internal politics. And then the other thing is, if you did have some kind of big transparency push that hit everybody, there's going to be the impact of that is going to be different depending on how things are organized and how official they are. The more official things are going to be more hit by the transparency type stuff, and the less official things are going to be less hit. So what a call for transparency actually does in an interesting way is moves power out of the official mechanisms and into the informal conspiracies that don't have to be transparent.
Another thing that I want to note about the abstract call for transparency is that it actually gives way to the sort of seesaw conception of WikiLeaks, which is to say that since its founding, both Democrats and Republicans have gone back and forth repeatedly on whether they love or hate WikiLeaks, and that tracks pretty closely with the extent to which WikiLeaks goes after one side or another with its releases.
Yeah, I would just say on both of those points, there's this. I think WikiLeaks is in a lot of ways responding to the same kind of institutional problems, more or less consciously. I don't know that Assange is actually aware of kind of the function that he plays totally in the larger system, but I think he's in a lot of ways it's almost like a kind of almost like an accelerationist type view on, oh well, if we just shine more light or publicize what's going on, that'll somehow kind of lead to better institutions or lead to a better outcome, when I think what actually tends to happen, or at least in the case of the release of the diplomatic cables, was that, to your point, Wolf, it kind of just played into whatever power politics were already going on, and in some ways it actually helped certain factions who were able to kind of take advantage of whatever the newfound information they found in it, and it didn't really necessarily do anything in the positive sense to make the American people more aware of how our government conducts diplomacy, say,
right.
which could have been one of the kind of byproducts of it.
So let's get back to the overarching narrative here with Hilger. So with the relationships he formed earlier, it seems that they did help him after about 1945 when he surrendered to U.S. forces. So let's talk about his move to the U.S. But I guess it wasn't quite as agentic as that. He was moved to the U.S. more or less. So let's just go into that for a bit.
Yeah. So Hilger kind of after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact falls apart, obviously because Hitler invades the Soviet Union in June 1941. The German diplomats are kicked out of Russia. They're sent back. Hilger is put in charge of Eastern questions for the Nazi German Foreign Minister Ribbentrop in Berlin, and that position puts him, I guess, in contact with a lot of the Nazi apparatus, including like the Reich Main Security Office, RHSA, which is involved in the Holocaust, and as well as the SS. And so obviously, even though Hilger, well, maybe it's not obvious, but Hilger was never a Nazi Party member, but that kind of didn't really preclude him from being, participating in war crimes and atrocities under the Third Reich. And so this fact is not lost on a kind of his American connections. And I think for them it was very much a calculation, both in personal terms as this is a good guy. I mean, in the view, not in my view necessarily, but in the view of people like Kennan, this guy was a civil servant who was caught up in a lot of this, and he was not necessarily a bad guy. And also, it happens to coincide with the kind of the national interest, in that he knows a lot about a country that we know very little about. And so they bring him in 1945 to the U.S. With a lot of other German technicians and officials, and then they kind of interrogate him more or less in a series of interviews over months about the Soviet Union, and kind of in that process he demonstrates his value to them, and then there's kind of more that happens, but that's what happens right after the war.
Getting into the war crimes thing, there's this really interesting tension there of suppose you are just a dedicated civil servant and you get caught up in some insane regime, the rest of the government goes insane and they're doing a bunch of crazy stuff and that you don't necessarily agree with, but you're the obvious guy for the job. Which is what was happening in Hilger's case. He has to manage this situation where he's sort of aware of some crazy stuff going on that he doesn't agree with. That's a really interesting moral dilemma of what to do in that situation. Does he just resign? Does he just make his views known? Does he go along with it? And I know one of the things that you mentioned is that he kind of had active disagreement with their plans in the East, and he would sort of make his views known, and then to the point where at one point he got threatened and told to shut up. Is that right? Yeah,
so you're right. It's this very complicated question from an ethical or moral dimension.
Yeah.
And I think that's true with a lot of when you look at there's really no clear way to to think about Hilger. I think it's not clear on the moral side what the right or kind of wrong action is there.
But in terms of securing an outcome that's more personally beneficial, it makes sense to kind of ingratiate yourself to the new power structure. And make yourself useful to their interests in such a way that they have the incentive to win the moral perception story, right? Because there's going to be a difference between whether your actions were moral per se, or whether the story is out there that what you did was moral. And those are two very different questions, right? There's the actual fundamental objective moral status of those actions and the public perception of them. But it's the public perception of them that ends up mattering at the end of the day to like whether you have any kind of like freedom, or whether you're actually tried for war crimes and tossed in prison or executed, or whether you end up advising some of the top foreign policy founders in the 20th century in the U.S. And
it also feeds into, I think, the two philosophies that you see on part of the United States in terms of to what extent is it possible to flip the institutions of an enemy structure into ones that are now friendly to you. And in the case of Germany and Japan, we do see one that essentially assumes that you can take out a leadership and then reform and reintegrate the lower parts of those institutions, so to speak, into a structure that is pro-American, democratic and liberal and so on. The other philosophy, obviously, is the kind of one that pursues an uncompromising sort of a sterilization of the institutions that you saw under actions like de-Baathification. The problem with that approach is that it depends on being able to actually have the personnel and manpower to en masse replace the old institutions with new people of the same or greater competence. And in a complex country like Germany, really any modern state, that's going to be extremely difficult to do. And so Hilger's Hilger's depending on the U.S. accepting that first version of that philosophy.
Yeah, well, like even in the case of Iraq, right, which is where you're talking about with the de-Baathification, like, they fire all the Baathists and try to set up this new state, and it's basically a failed state almost immediately, and all the Baathists go and start ISIS.
But notice as well that it's more possible to do the first philosophy because those connections already exist in the network. Because if you don't have any connection whatsoever to personnel, then you essentially have to take a public judgment about their moral character and how much you can trust them. And that was almost certainly the case in Iraq. But in the case of Germany, there were in fact these networks existing, and diplomats could personally vouch for the character or the role that someone had played, and that actually made it far easier to then choose who you were going to reintegrate.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few different questions here, right? Like one of them is the sort of trustworthiness question. Like, okay, do we have information that leads us to believe that we can trust this person to be like generally in line with what we're trying to do and to cooperate with us? In which case, like the personal connections and so on, like a really important thing. But there's this other interesting question in the Hilger case that I think is like implicitly on the table, which is what would we have him do in like 1941, 1942, etc., right? And I think that question is very, very difficult to answer when you look at the thing and you actually like, you don't try to like, just like, oh yeah, he was involved in war crimes, therefore he's like a bad person. You actually dig into it. It's like, all right, well, like if he made the wrong choice, it implies that there was something else he could have done. And like digging into what those things were and coming up with like a superior answer to his situation, I think is like an exercise that is right. Kind of a very interesting exercise to do.
Because I've actually thought about that question quite a bit, as because when you're going through these archives and you kind of feel like you're almost, I mean, clearly you're not literally meeting this person, but you almost feel like you kind of get a sense of their personality or whatever.
Right.
It seems to me like he was both a bit naive and also a bit of a coward, and that's actually something that comes out in some of the people that that knew him have described him that way. And so the question obviously is like, where is the line between survival instincts and cowardice, right? Because clearly he was not the only German diplomat that continued to faithfully serve the Reich, even though it got taken over by a kind of like a crazy ruthless and mass murdering ideological regime. But at the same time, I guess you could say he probably should have been more active in his like sabotage, maybe.
But it's worth pointing out too that this burden of that the personnel in a regime are morally expected to resist, this is itself an outgrowth of the post-World War II attitude that was taken to those questions, because and Germany in particular had this strong cultural expectation that you do your job and sort of obey hierarchy. But this was true across the board, even in the United States. Before World War II, the idea that you would actively ultimately seek to undermine your own government as an official. I mean, there were probably situations where that would be maybe expected somehow, but it was a far narrower window than it would be now. And that in and of itself is an outgrowth of ideological war, right? Which is really the Enlightenment era. I mean, before the French Revolution, before the, the late 1700s, 1800s, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find almost anyone kind of saying that you're supposed to hold personnel morally accountable for doing their work in a regime in which they operated, unless there was kind of just, universally recognized horrific action going on. And I would say that after World War II, the sense was that these sorts of things had happened, and so you had to have a stronger moral framework. But the people we're looking at here are not operating in a world in which that already exists.
Yeah, like an interesting point here is like to judge people for like not having resisted hard enough or something sort of implicitly sets up this expectation that people ought to resist governments that they disagree with in active ways, including sabotage, like up to the point of like aiding foreign powers. And that doesn't only apply to America's enemies, that also applies to America as well, right? So it's like, is America setting up this moral expectation that we ought to sabotage our own government and our own society and aid foreign powers if we like disagree with something that the regime is doing?
By the way,
That's
I
like
don't
a really
exactly
interesting
expect.
question.
I mean, most of the people in these situations, when they're gripped by various narratives about what is moral and what is immoral, they're not exactly in the right state of mind to be making like strong and like sound and reasoned moral claims. It's more like moral hysteria sort of captures them, and then they end up playing into the interests of some other faction that's not the current government.
Yeah, well, so are you talking about the people who get caught up in the crazy regime, or the people who get caught up in like a craziness of resistance?
Or craziness of resistance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's sort of like craziness on both sides, basically.
Yeah, if you look at, so I think, for instance, like Timothy Snyder, the historian, is probably done among the best jobs at like documenting the people who actually kind of resisted the Nazis or kind of like protected Jews, and he explains how kind of extremely rare that was. It took this combination of either like almost like especially rare morality or a combination or some kind of other identity construct that was going on where someone already felt part of like a persecuted minority themselves, and then was kind of had already kind of thought through the act of moral resistance against the state because of that. And it's actually extremely, like, we have these Hollywood ideas of Schindler's List or something, where we think that half, almost implicitly like, well, like half the Germans were trying to rescue Jews, or like half the people in Poland or whatever. And that's very far from like the reality. You had to be someone that was not only basically risking your own life, but kind of acting against every like rational economic and kind of survival incentive to do that. And that's maybe to say that those people really are saintly and kind of righteous in an almost superhuman way, but that's it's very hard to kind of expect a society to function in which everyone operates like that. I mean, that's why it's important to have institutions and states and things that work properly, right? This
is the kind of thing that like thinking through the contradictions in these kinds of thought experiments of like, what would you have this person do or whatever. It, like, for me at least, it kind of exposes an almost incoherence in the usual concept of moral judgment. I find it an interesting question. That's why I've like kind of steered this towards that, like of like, how do we think about moral judgment in the area of politics? And I think it's actually really a hard question.
Let's think about the fact that in Hilger's case, he's in the Soviet Union, meaning that resistance on his part would have essentially probably have taken the form of becoming an agent of the Soviet Union. The reason this would have been ironic is, of course, as the piece mentions, that the reason he comes to the United States later on is precisely to start the Cold War propaganda process against the Soviet Union and take, the article mentions during the war, Stalin was Uncle Joe, this, friendly guy. He was an ally. And then part of Hilger's job is to help with the process where he is now being recast and he's a tyrant and he's Stalin and he's, this brutal, ruthless dictator. And so the question, this public question of who is perceived as the power that you cannot cooperate with, is itself the result of these interests working in the background. And I think, as Jonah mentioned, whenever you're resisting one power, that means you are either directly or indirectly collaborating with a different power. And I think it's extremely clear in this scenario.
Regarding Uncle Joe, I always like to think of it as though there's this massive sort of like machine in some dark basement of the U.S. government somewhere called the moral machine, which is some kind of fusion of U.S. government officials and the media. And, they'll get a slip of paper coming down some chute, and it says, like, okay, we're friends with Joseph Stalin now.
Right, it's very 1984.
Right. And it's like, okay, oh, man, all right, how are we going to do this one? All right, okay. And then they feed the piece of paper through the machine, and it grinds a little bit, and then it keeps going, and it produces some smoke and some steam. And then about 6 months later, everyone in public is like, yeah, he's not that bad of a guy. Uncle Joe, yeah. And, that's sort of, too literalistic, right? But it's an interesting sort of like description of how it works without it being so concrete, which is that there is a moral machine, there are priorities, and the public story of something's morality matters so much more than the actual
the public story is just being like kind of often like cooked up as a result of these institutional interests. It's just one of the really interesting things we get into in the piece. It's like kind of notable just on the 1984 angle that what is it? Is it 1948 that Orwell published 1984, or is it the 50s?
I don't know the exact.
It's right around that time.
Yeah, it's around then. Yeah.
Anyway, so that's a notable thing. But yeah, like let's bring it towards like
published 1949.
So like, now we've brought Hilger over to the United States. Let's talk a little bit about his work with the United States in shaping those narratives, in shaping how we dealt with the Soviet Union, etc. Like, what did those things look like?
Yeah, so he had all of this knowledge on the Soviet Union, and especially kind of during the wartime period. Again, he had a lot of disagreements with Hitler and Ribbentrop, and I think I mean, I don't know that it was exactly from a moral position, but he clearly saw that what he believed were German like state interests were not being served. I mean,
Right.
like in hindsight and in retrospect, and like knowing what we know about like Hitler and his ideology, it seems kind of like pretty clear that he was kind of into this like racial project and this like Nazi ideology project that
Like to the detriment
of like
interests.
the German geopolitics, which so but I think something like that was kind of and this is where Hilger is kind of like naive. It's like he didn't like almost realize that like that the state was not actually acting in its own interest anymore, or because it had been taken over by this ideology. But suffice it to say that he had a lot of thinking about what had gone on the Eastern Front, especially people like General Vlasov, who was a defector from the Soviet Union, and he had been
to Germany, or
yes, he had basically defected to Germany, and then people like Hilger had been agitating to kind of have the Germans make much more use of like these defector forces,
right.
And also to do kind of psychological operations in the Soviet Union that kind of would have like or in the Eastern Europe as well, that would have kind of turned the sentiment against Stalin, and he thought that that would have kind of increased Germany's chances in the war on the Eastern Front. But of course, like the Nazi ideological project not only was kind of the dominant the dominant goal of their war effort, but it was also to the detriment of what may have actually been able to help them militarily, right? So Hilger describes at one point how basically they were getting reports back from the front lines when they invaded Ukraine about how the German tanks were met with like flowers and bread, right? Like the Ukrainian children were so happy, they felt like they were being liberated, but any of that goodwill was like immediately squandered by the fact that like the SS took over a lot of the occupation efforts, and in the mind of like Nazi racial ideology, the Slavic people were basically considered like Untermenschen in the same sense that Jews were, right? So they this kind of racial ideology had in a lot of ways like inhibited any kind of successful politics that may have happened.
Yeah, this is really interesting. It comes back to, I think, in Republic by Plato, there's like discussion obviously of the nature of justice, right? Like what is this justice thing? And one of the key features that I think Socrates puts forth for what justice is that justice is effective. Like justice is not something that shoots itself in the foot and loses, and in fact injustice is something that shoots itself in the foot. And so it's this really interesting idea that like evil is actually not an effective strategy, and or like injustice is not an effective strategy. Like if you can't, if you're not like treating your comrades well, or treating your allies well, or treating potential friends well, then you're not going to be able to succeed. And
he gives the example of like a band of thieves.
Right, and like among the thieves, like if they are perfectly unjust, they're not going to be able to cooperate.
Right.
So like even among the thieves, they need some level of justice, like this idea of justice among thieves to get them to even cooperate enough to steal other people's stuff. And I think that's like an interesting notion to deploy here, and sort of like how we're thinking about, since we've gotten into like the moral discussion, just like bringing some of these Greeks and how they thought about it. It's like I just think it's this really important notion that like the doing something that is morally bad is like very often just ineffective, and like that these things they coincide actually quite a bit.
There's a part of this that I like to bring up, which in the article it was kind of discussed at the very end, and that's Hilger's role under Adenauer in West Germany after the war, and specifically in the 50s. And the line for me that I find encapsulates what was going on there most perfectly, because let's remember here, Hilger had been associated with the Third Reich. West Germany had been built on this idea of denazification. New institutions were being built, and then after Hilger's rehabilitation in the United States, he is sent to Germany. And you mention here, Hilger was appointed Botschaftsrat, that is a counselor in the Foreign Office, the exact same position in the same office where he had worked under Ribbentrop. Not only that, he's promised a full pension for the entire period from 1923 to his future retirement. And you sort of quote Nicholas Poppa here, the Russian linguist, and he credits Hilger for extensive support of Adenauer. So I'd like to hear a bit about how Hilger was able to operate in this new West German regime given his past. Was this only because the US greased the wheels, so to speak, or was the German establishment itself essentially glad to have him back?
Yeah, so I have to confess that this is not a part of Hilger's life that I'm especially well versed in. I kind of know the general outlines, and I know how he returned to Germany, to West Germany in this case. What I would say is I think. So I've chosen to focus on Hilger, but he's just one of kind of a panoply of German diplomatic figures that kind of figures in this trans-war period. He's probably the most interesting because of the amount of like time that he spends in the U.S. and everything. But he's just one of a number of kind of former Third Reich German diplomats that are rehabilitated and kind of end up running the show in the Adenauer Foreign Office. And in fact, that factors into the critiques that are kind of levied against the West German establishment into the 60s. Is that basically they're all kind of like closet Nazis, and that they're just continuing to do in Vietnam what they were doing to the Jews. Like, you get a lot of these type of narratives in the 60s in the West German context, like the student movements and everything. And so in some sense there's truth to it, in the sense that there was actually this degree of continuity. But I'm not an expert on that. I think there's been some Germany's done some of its own kind of navel gazing, and there's been a bunch of like federal inquiries into the history of their own kind of like foreign office and agencies. The one on the Foreign Office is called the Foreign Office in the Past, and it's like this I think it's like a 900-page report on kind of the Nazi connections to the Foreign Office, both in the Third Reich and then after.
Well, it's kind of funny because if one looks at the geopolitics of West versus East Germany and the rhetoric that was used in that period, one of the major talking points of the East German regime, which is the communist regime, which is Soviet-backed, had consistently been, they had this national myth that, their state was run by people, and most of the people in East Germany had never been Nazis. They had been part of the resistance. They had always been more loyal to the communists, and so they kind of retcon that history. But in their relation to West Germany, they would always take this line that in fact the Allies had just kept the Nazis in power, that in some sense the industrialists and even the state apparatus itself it was just the same people in power. In fact, when the wall was first built, the name given to it by the East Germans was the Anti-Fascist Protection Rampart. And so you can see that actually this is quite an important part of how they justified themselves and the measures they took. The irony, of course, in this article is that, in fact, we see some of this actually happening, which would have made it quite difficult, I would think, for Adenauer and for the West German regime to counter that propaganda from the DDR. So it's sort of an irony there for anyone who has studied German history in the second half of the 20th century.
I mean, for them, it's like it's much more real. This kind of left-wing criticism that's volleyed at basically anyone on the right as being Nazis. I mean, in some cases, it happens to be true when you're in, post-war West Germany. It was basically, like you're saying, a lot of the industrial apparatus, the state, clearly whole government departments were kind of run by the same people before 45 as after.
So on the theme of rebuilding here, I think this might be a good place for us to transition to discussing some of the other articles that we had scheduled for this week. And in this case, I think a good one to start with would be Stephen Borthwick's piece. This one was titled "Rebuilding the Middle East, Christians, Shiites, and Secularists Join Forces." And just to quickly go over the article, this piece looks at alliances that have been built on the ground in several countries, mostly in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, by Christians in the Middle East who are a minority in most countries, who have been quite adversely affected by U.S. foreign policy in the region. Quite often, Saddam's regime, but also the Assad government, had worked with them to varying extents, and when destabilization occurred, and specifically in Iraq when the overthrow of the Saddam government occurred, they began undergoing persecution. And so this piece looks at how Christians have been working with different groups in order to create stability, and now going forward, how the next generation of Middle Eastern politics is going to be shaped by these coalitions. Specifically, what this piece focuses on is the fact that these coalitions are generally with groups that are hostile to the United States and also to Israel. And in this case, Shia communities and organizations such as Hezbollah and Iranian-backed militias have tried quite hard to reach out to Christians because it allows these groups to gain an ally, but it also lets them seem less sectarian. They've been able to build brands for themselves as protecting, all the communities in the areas that they control, which means that those who are under persecution from ISIS and from similar groups have a lot of incentive to cooperate with them. And you can especially see the results of this in Lebanon. The piece discusses how Hezbollah, which is a Shia Islamist organization that's known for being quite anti-Zionist, that the U.S. generally is condemned. I think they are still considered a terrorist organization by the U.S. And they, in fact, had conflict with the Christians in Lebanon some decades back. But now in this sort of new era where they've taken a strong stance, they fought ISIS alongside the Assad government, Christians in Lebanon have increasingly had this sense that it is, at least in part because of Hezbollah, that Lebanon has been kept safe from organizations such as ISIS, who would, at the hands of which they would suffer extreme persecution. And the theme of rebuilding here is, I think, good to highlight on, because as mentioned earlier, in the case of Iraq, a just total deconstruction of the state was undertaken. Obviously, in Syria and in Lebanon, the states in those territories are still standing, But particularly in Syria, regions of the country were under ISIS control for several years. There was instability in other regions. There's been immense population displacement. And in this case, coalitions that are forming for that process of rebuilding are ones where the US now has to decide if it's going to play the game of realpolitik. Is it willing to work with people, which it has historically opposed for the sake of stability and peace? Or will it take a harder approach? And examples are given in the piece. For example, there was the famous incident with Ted Cruz where he was speaking to a group of Middle Eastern Christians and made a statement along the lines that if they would not support Israel, he would not support them. The problem, of course, with the statement is that, in fact, most Middle Eastern Christians do not support Israel because there's a history of persecution there as well. And within the countries in which they live, countries such as Lebanon, Christians in those countries are, in a sense, patriotic. They are loyal to their country when conflicts do break out with Israel. And so Ted Cruz sort of displayed in this incident that a hardline approach toward these coalitions would lose groups that might even otherwise be willing to work with the United States. So, Matt, I think it would be interesting to go to you and maybe hear some of your thoughts on in this rebuilding process in the Middle East. What do you think are some of the lessons to be learned here about how to do that? Of course.
Wow, the easy question. I mean, one of the things that strikes me about this piece and also about kind of the issues it tackles is the role of like Russian geopolitics and how they kind of use the Orthodox Church in a lot of ways as kind of an almost like an arm of the state. I think the guy's name is Kirill, the patriarch.
Yeah,
of
Patriarch
Moscow.
Kirill.
I mean, who has his own kind of KGB past. He
Right.
As basically any senior figure in the Orthodox Church under the Soviet Union that was allowed to like leave the country would have in that case. So it's kind of funny to me that like the president of Russia today and the head of the Orthodox Church both are like these KGB guys who like grew up under the very like notionally atheistic Soviet system, and now they're kind of using this as kind of a geopolitical play in the Middle East. So that's what strikes me there. It strikes me as another situation where if the U.S. was actually kind of committed to rebuilding institutions and working with people, kind of meeting them where they are, and not kind of like necessarily expecting them to already kind of have like a particular worldview or a particular ideology, that it would be a lot easier to like come to a kind of workable modus vivendi where there could be an end of hostilities. Clearly, like things would require like decades of actual kind of economic reform and growth to actually get into a place where they were like very successful countries, but there's a difference between like being successful kind of like prosperous people and just kind of having like a basic survival end of hostilities. And I think in a lot of these conversations, whether it's the Balkans or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or any of these other kind of intractable diplomatic issues, we often are kind of, I think, setting our sights too high on what we need to actually just have an end to kind of hostilities at a basic level.
What this also brings up interestingly too is that a true hegemon does have the ability to kind of seamlessly demand that its opponents fully adopt its worldview as a prerequisite for coming to the table for any negotiations. And the very fact that the theme of sort of dropping that requirement is starting to rise recently in more realist foreign policy circles kind of indicates to me that the U.S. has already lost on some level, because if it still had the power to
lost
be
hegemonic status.
it lost,
because
right.
you have to be pretty hegemonic to be like, all right, you can come to the table, but you have to give up like everything.
Right,
like,
and the fact
your
that the
entire
U.S.
worldview. Like, that's
keeps
pretty
being
intense.
the fact that the U.S. keeps being outmaneuvered while simultaneously, keeping this as a requirement of its foreign policy shows that sort of like.
Well, the thing's stale.
Yeah, the institutions haven't quite caught up to this reality.
The reality, yeah.
And this gets back to like what we were talking about in the Hilger piece of like, okay, so like, Hilger
there was
and
a
Kennan,
time when the U.S. could make
Hilger and Kennan and
and
these
I
guys, they built institutions, or like they were involved in institutions that were actually, the institution was driving things and actually looking at the strategic fundamentals, and then the ideology was kind of following that. And one of the big themes of the piece is that over time, as those institutions have decayed and have kind of failed the succession problem for a variety of reasons, the ideology now is almost the thing that's driving, because the people coming in now, the only thing they've ever heard of is the public story, right? And so that like the system's kind of like getting high on its own supply in a way.
Right, and in this context of kind of the hegemon and how many degrees of freedom, because it all is basically relative, right? There's never like an absolute, kind of power dynamic.
Yeah.
It's all about kind of your willingness to kind of put yourself out there and kind of put capabilities into action. And I think let's take 3 examples that are kind of dealt with to various extents by these pieces. We have, like in the one case, the kind of post-war international order and all that entails, and kind of the ability to kind of dictate terms to like Germany and Japan after the end of the war. In another case, maybe let's look at like let's say like the Camp David Accords under President Carter in the 1970s, and you probably have there like still a very hegemonic position.
Can you go over what that was about?
Yeah, so the idea being, I guess, an attempt at kind of bringing some diplomatic resolution to disputes between Arabs and Israelis.
Okay, yeah.
And then in the 90s we had the Dayton Accords in the Balkans. In the Balkans. And so I think in each one of those cases, they're not kind of perfectly comparable, but you have less and less of that kind of ability to dictate terms. And I think you see in what results from each of those kind of settlements, let's call them, that you actually have to have kind of these greater and greater degrees of like complexity in the political arrangements that follow, because you have less of a kind of hegemonic ability to actually kind of say like, actually this is how it's going to go, and it's going to be clean cut, and so at the same time, your
capabilities are declining,
right? Or at least your power. So I don't know that it's necessarily the capabilities.
But I mean, like the institutional capabilities to to come up with and deal with that complexity that's necessary. Like it's notable that like post-war reconstruction in Germany and Japan, it's like we conquered them at the height of our power, right? And like so we're very much able to dictate. Whereas like nowadays, like we're not like rolling into Europe and conquering the Balkans at the height of our power and like dictating what's going to happen. It's like almost sort of retreating.
And there's also the thing that has to be brought up, which is that in the Middle East, in all these situations, even if you have superpower status, you have to be able to communicate, and the people you're trying to work with have to have a certain level of trust that you actually understand the local situation. I think the most important point in a way that the Rebuilding the Middle East piece takes up is the notion that the Western governing class, and particularly the media class, is tremendously illiterate when it comes to questions of religion, culture, in the way that they're actually experienced outside of the West. Whereas Russia, so there is on the one hand this historic relationship that exists between the Middle East's Christians and Russia that goes back to the imperial era, and that's discussed somewhat in the piece. One of the major statesmen, a number of major statesmen, in fact, in the end of the imperial period had relationships with an organization that was trying to elevate Russia's status in the Middle East on religious grounds, giving it this role of a Christian protector. So the group is called the Imperial Orthodox Palestine Society, and it still operates today. Putin gave its formal recognition in 2012 for its work. They carry out dinners in places like the UK, and so this is a theme that has existed in the Russian state continuously through several markedly different regimes. And you could probably argue that Russia's imperial history gives it a certain understanding of how a great diversity of ethnicities and religions live side by side in the more Eurasian context, and that this translates better to understanding the Middle Eastern situation than does the Western view in which ethnicity or religion, these are kind of considered, they're ideally supposed to be secondary characteristics to your status as a citizen in a civic state. Mm-hmm. And particularly in the religious context, right? Religion, that's a belief. It's a belief and it's supposed to be private, because the modern West no longer thinks of religion as being actually a communal thing with a cultural aspect that you can't just sort of exit by virtue of, say, no longer going to church. And we see in the Hilger piece there seems to be a very strong common understanding about what the situation is and what the stakes are, whereas in the Middle East this is just not the case.
Yeah, I mean, like to expand on your point of like how the West sees sort of religion and ethnicity and culture and so on, like to kind of like the modern mainstream, those things are just like different flavors of liberalism. Like they're like different kind of colors that you can slap on the same underlying thing. Like, oh yeah, everyone's kind of the same. Everyone has the same underlying interests. People just want to be citizens in a democracy, and like, people have their little cultural things. Occasionally, some like fundamentalists get in charge and like turn it into something more than that. But that's actually an aberration, and like actually they're all just people waiting to become liberals with like of different flavors.
Yeah, I think it underscores.
Well, and you could see this most especially in the rhetoric of extremist versus moderate Islam or any other religion. The idea being that in its true form, these religions will actually turn you into a good liberal, and it's only their excess or their mutation that makes you deviate from that worldview. And of course this is ridiculous. I mean, I believe Erdogan actually made a statement in a speech, it might be a couple years ago now, openly rejecting, I don't remember his exact phrase, but essentially rejecting the idea that there was a moderate and an extreme Islam. Now, of course, he has his own political reasons for doing that, but this is in fact more, this understands better the way that religion is actually viewed outside of the West, and that's why it was a useful political statement to make.
Yeah, well,
I think. Go on, Matt. It kind of it's to ignore the whole history of how these kind of religious systems factor in and can kind of compare to state authority, and how it's actually kind of an aberration historically that in the West we developed the separation of church and state. Right. So that like it has to do with the history of kind of the fall of the Roman Empire and the medieval kind of feudal power structures being very decentralized compared to the kind of but still kind of falling under the like umbrella of the Roman Catholic Church, which had very weak like local political authority, but was able to kind of be this this kind of great bestower of kind of
legitimacy,
kind of like legitimacy, right? And so I think we have a very contingent set of like institutions and history in the Western Western Europe and kind of in the, by extension in North America, that kind of has lived through this long history of having separation of church and state. So it's easy for us to think that this is somehow the way that the world works, But I think, for instance, in the way that you saw how much of a disaster kind of trying to do nation building in Iraq was, and this kind of very misguided assumption that somehow a bunch of Iraqis were just kind of like liberal Westerners, waiting for the Americans to topple their government. I mean, that underscores to me just how kind of fragile and how kind of contingent a lot of these systems are, and how we should probably try to rebuild and to build successful institutions and structures that will allow people to have peace and security and prosperity, but to kind of demand a kind of ideological obedience or something like that is to actually kind of go against our practical goals.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's like it is practical to demand ideological obedience, but like you have to be Muhammad, basically. Like you have to be like rolling in with a big army
not
and like convert people by the sword, right? George Bush can't do it because they're not actually thinking clearly about what they're trying to do, right? They're like, oh yeah, these people, they want what we offer. They're just like us, except like they happen to have a dictatorship, so we just go in and topple the dictator and everything will be fine. But you have to think more like early Islam, where it's like you roll in and you say, look, you're now with us, and if you don't like that, well, too bad. Now you're an apostate, and that's off with your head or whatever.
I mean, it's slightly
not
more,
to caricature them, but like they were quite forceful in that.
Yeah, it's slightly more complicated than that. But then we would have to get into a big discussion about insurgency and counterinsurgency, and that can be a discussion for another podcast. I'm actually going to probably write something about counterinsurgency in a bit. Yeah. For Palladium.
But speaking, and speaking of Islam in this context, like that Islamic publication, Traversing Tradition, had an interesting article on how like the U.S. imperial machine is kind of trying to like transmute Islam into like
That's
like
right.
a flavor of liberalism.
Yeah, and you can see this in a lot of the new grant funded like Islamic studies programs at various top universities, and it's very clear that those efforts are an attempt to put Islam through the Boston machine, machine of liberalism.
Yeah, the machine that turns Christianity into liberalism, and
where it's like
turns liberalism. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, and that turns religion into a culture, right? Which is an entirely different thing. I think the best way to think about the process of what we could call the ideological westernization of Islam is that what it tries to do, right? Because the issues of confrontation that come up, like the hijab, for example, they can very easily be portrayed as cultural problems, right? And as saying that hijab, the act of a woman covering herself, well, this is a cultural difference, but we shouldn't assume that means that there are differences of belief here in terms of fundamental values. Now, it makes sense to say that in a way, because if you have a conflict breaking out, you want to find some way to resolve that and to promote goodwill. But in fact, the ultimate result of that for anyone with religious belief is that your system of belief is now reduced to a set of practices that don't necessarily correlate with any number of ideas, and so the idea ends up being that you can engage in certain cultural practices like maybe you do wear hijab, or maybe even engage in prayer and things like this, but in fact your fundamental belief system is essentially that of a Western secular Harvard-trained liberal. And in the case of the Traversing Tradition series, that series I think quite accurately analyzed that as a threat from a religious perspective to Islam. And because it's something that has actually occurred before. So if you look at the Catholic Church in the United States, when it first arrives, it's quite marginalized. It's seen as a threat. Now, of course, there's eminent Catholic universities. Bishops in the United States are invited to the White House. It's quite socially prominent. But in fact, the actual life of most Catholics in that country is not markedly different from that of anyone else, despite the fact that in name there are supposed to be these distinguishing religious beliefs which are quite countercultural. And so this is why the religious literacy aspect is important, because we should be able to tell that as this process of trying to culturize, let's say, Islam continues, there is going to be naturally a response to that which opposes that process, because it accurately understands Islam as a religion, and specifically as an Abrahamic religion that has universal claims, that has, certain sets of doctrine that can't just be waved aside. If one understands religion properly, there are things that you can predict that you simply can't predict if you actually fall for the illusion, so to speak, that actually this is just a culture and we don't need to assume anything.
Yeah, well, this is this kind of comes back to Palladium's mission of kind of popping ourselves out of the Western liberal paradigm to be able to understand things from these other perspectives, so that we actually can engage with them and learn from them, and like strategize about them more effectively.
And so two of the reasons why I actually really like this article is because it's baffling to two sort of like factions in the U.S. that have an interesting amount of power. The first would be the evangelical Protestants, who sort of have a bit of an uncritical amount of support for Israel for various eschatological reasons, and so exert some amount of domestic political influence in that direction. And for them, the idea that Middle Eastern Christians would be opposed to their vision for the Middle East is kind of baffling, right? They don't really understand it, and clearly neither did Ted Cruz, right? It's not. I'm not just talking about. I'm not making a caricature of some like dumb prot in some like some Pentecostal church somewhere, right? Like this is all the way up and down.
I mean, if your vision for the Middle East is the Jews better control Israel so that we can have the imminent rapture occur,
Right.
Like, yes, that could
Yeah.
that could lead to some
Difficult.
political problems.
But then there's there's also the of course the other side of sort of higher status Western liberals who maybe this didn't used to be the case, but it is the case now, where among that group religious literacy is incredibly low, and so you always see these various cases of articles kind of making fun of religious reporters at places like the Washington Post or the New York Times, because they routinely flub the most basic elements of describing religions, especially Christianity. And of course, part of the reason for that is the domestic conflict between those two groups, and one deciding not to really pay attention to or learn anything about the other. Actually, I mean, they both do this, and of course that's one of the reasons driving the lack of religious literacy there. And so for them, they would have a more difficult time understanding, before reading this article, understanding the nuances of the situation in the Middle East, because you do have to understand the intricate details of religious politics to get it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean...
Hold on, Ash.
Well, and I think one of the main problems...
I agree, and I think one of the things that's interesting to me is I think we don't even well understand kind of how religious needs like function in general, right? So I think in the American context today, these ideologies often function a lot like religions do in kind of more traditional societies, but we treat them as if we treat the ideologies as if they're politics, and we treat religion as if it's culture or kind of social. Right. So there's I think a very much like an epistemological or analytical problem, and that I don't think we actually like understand a lot of the phenomena.
Well, these
as
things
what
are
they
kind of like outside of the liberal ontology, right? Like in the liberal ontology, you have the free individual who has like private desires.
I don't know that it's just
they
even
fulfill
liberal.
through-
It's just kind of the like the culture that we're living in right now,
which is liberalism.
But right, but I mean, in the sense that like speaking, as a Catholic from Boston, right? So like, to the points that were brought up earlier, right? Like I don't know that a lot of I think a lot of the way that like Catholicism functions in American society is not the way that a traditional religion would, and that a lot of the actual religious needs are filled by are filled by ideology, and they're filled by kind of other
Right.
philosophies that people have. They're filled by other kind of, or in some cases they're just left kind of unanswered, right? And so it creates kind of some kind of problems.
I want to talk about one thing for a second, and it's this hilarious, really funny part of American society where they have this strange process of integrating weird, bizarre groups, whether they're religious or sort of like fetish based or based on some kind of weird interest not totally accepted by society, at least yet. It's kind of like, I'm an American too. I'm just like you. I like, baseball games and like eating hot dogs and like the flag and stuff. I just do X also. Right. And it's this very kind of like Reddit tier approach to being to having your kind
Looks
of
like we just lost the Reddit audience.
oops.
But that's the story of American Catholics. I mean, in a lot
is.
of
No,
ways,
no,
it's
it
like,
is. It
it's
is.
like we're just like the wasps,
Yes.
except we just have this like weird thing that we like
Just
also
different thing.
pray to the Pope. We believe in the Pope, and then they're like, I mean, in the old days, that was like, the Pope, was
his
was
foreign
basically
power,
like
suspicious foreign power.
hanged in effigy, on Boston Common, back under
Right.
the
It's like
the Puritan days.
almost it's like
The Church
way,
of Satan does this too on
Yeah,
Twitter,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
They're like,
They're ridiculous.
I know, but they're just so emblematic of, and this process to some extent has to occur in all societies, right? But it's just funny the particular American way of going about it.
Yeah, well,
it's like-
I think.
Well, in the Catholic case, I think you've seen the end of that arc, which is just that the integration becomes finalized with essentially religious apostasy. So ex-Catholics are one of the largest, denominations in the U.S. and maybe Catholics kind of being one of the first major non-Protestant religions in America couldn't have seen this coming, but new religious communities such as Muslims or other communities can look back and see how this retrospectively played out. And so the context there is very different. Of course, Catholics as well, modern Catholics have very different views on questions of secularism than maybe they did in the 1960s or the 1920s, because you have to essentially update as a community if you have this interest in remaining distinct and carrying on to future generations, where if you see that you're essentially getting so assimilated that you cease to exist, then in fact now you have to start pursuing your distinctiveness.
Yeah, well,
Right.
there's some important points to make here on that. So, like, first of all, like with respect to the thing being like its distinctiveness dissolved over time. Like Islam right now looks like very, very foreign to America, but I think over time, like as that community grows and as the program of Westernization of Islam continues, they're going to end up being more like the Catholics, and then eventually apostatize and everything.
a lot of that foreignness is political as well.
Yeah, no, exactly. And then a point I wanted to make is just how much the whole ontology of like the idea of a religion, the way we think of a religion these days, is just like it's a very contingent thing on the shape of our current sort of order of society. It's like the thing that like is sort of more fundamentally universal is that a society has an order to it. It has like a moral order, it has an institutional order, it has like how people think about the thing or the culture and all these aspects. And and you get these like remnants of different orders, right? And like what we think of as religions, like Catholicism was like a previous order that existed, or Protestantism was like a previous order that existed, right? And Islam is this alternate order, right? Like from kind of almost another civilization. And like likewise with a bunch of these things, they're sort of these like remnants of a different civilizational order. And you get kind of like which piece of those things survives into like being able to like somewhat coexist with the currently dominant order is like entirely contingent on the nature of the currently dominant thing. So like the fact that it's like the cultural tropes or whatever, or like this idea of personal belief or something, like basically like religion looks like personal belief to us because that's kind of like the only thing that you're allowed to do differently in a way, except that like, you know, over time that dissolves because the institutions are dissolved. But like it puts it, like a point I want to make, like was especially with respect to like Islam and Catholics in the West, is it puts like if those communities are trying to actually like keep their distinctiveness and keep the order that they're actually dedicated to and stay dedicated to that puts them in a position of not just like, oh, we're trying to maintain our little religious community. It's like it's actually a position of total rebellion, like because they're supporting an entirely different order against the order that currently exists. And I'm not saying like, oh, you know, this is bad or like the system should treat them like that. I'm just saying that like for them to actually win, they have to succeed at this like this much more total game than I think anyone is aware of. Like the kind of mainstream thing will and does crush these alternate things unless they become you know, like Judaism kind of like adapted to life in a host society, or like win somehow or escape somehow. Like it's not something that like the thing that currently fills the niche that we call religion in the West is not like a universal contingent thing. It's like a remnant of this larger thing.
Yeah, I think the most interesting thing there is just this understanding of like how boxed in kind of traditional religion is as a result of kind of the dominant, you know.
It's highly defanged.
Yeah, it's basically like the only role that it can serve is to be this kind of almost like this transferable, like you could substitutable like little personal box that like we all just kind of can. You could replace it with Buddhism.
That's right.
You can replace it with veganism, like whatever it is, like what. Like,
but I'm still an American.
It's like, what kind of music are you into, right?
Right.
It's
It's like because of how atomized we are. Like the only thing that religion can be is a kind of like you know your
subculture,
own, you know, personal kind of, you know, thing, or what you're saying about, you know, this the kind of like you know, fetish communities or whatever. Like that can also check this box, you know. That there's no difference. There's no or in to your point, Wolf. There's no like larger sense of meaning or order that it's serving.
Yeah. Whereas those things, like if you take those things seriously as they are sort of like as they were constructed, you realize that it actually
or as
does
they actually functioned in past.
But I'm going to say
you realize that it does have this nature of being a larger order. So for it to succeed as itself, it has to, like, you're talking about a much more existential game.
This is not really about liberalism. I think liberalism is just a particular method of integration, because the same dynamic of dominant and subordinate ideologies in competition in a given state is going to take place under any political system.
Like the Romans like did the same thing.
Right.
That was part of my like objection with necessarily like putting it all at the feet of liberalism.
It's not.
No, it's just liberalism is the current thing.
Yeah, it's this like I think it's any time you have a kind of all-encompassing, you know, hegemonic ideology or like kind of ideological paradigm.
Well, a hegemonic social order. Like it's not just an ideology; it's also all this other stuff.
Like if you're running a state and you have a particular state ideology and it's formal enough so everyone kind of understands it and acknowledges it, and for whatever reason you end up having a sizable population of a very kind of like inimical religion in your society to the values of the dominant state, there has to be
the process of integration.
A process of integration one way or another.
They have. There's going to be people saying like, oh well, actually our thing, like, you know, it's actually just like an aspect of your thing, or like a version of your thing.
And so it's a constant.
Well, and this is why the religious literacy thing is important, because it's not as if every regime does this as effectively, because, you know, we mentioned Russia and America earlier. You know, religious literacy it's not just that there's some inherent cultural value in understanding this, and maybe there is, but on a level beyond that, to actually interact correctly in a sense where you understand the way that the group or the community that you're interacting with thinks about themselves and you, requires religious literacy. And when that goes away, I'd like to point out, you know, it's not as if the media in particular doesn't somehow gain this more objective lens because of their low religious literacy, but actually that vacuum just ends up being filled with a bunch of tropes, where they take these kind of tropes that usually come from a very Western context and impose them over the world. There's an example here actually which I thought described this rather well. So this right after the recent Sri Lanka bombings on against the Christian community there. Exactly. There was a tweet from Andy West in this case, and I'll just read it very quick. There is no excuse for terror attacks against innocent people, but as a journalist, I saw Western Christian missionaries unscrupulously converting Buddhist orphans for food and shelter after the Asian tsunami. Don't send your prayers. # Sri Lanka blasts. Now, the thing about that is that, you know, if this comes to a particular trope, which is that Christianity is an essentially, you know, Western, white, and so on sort of phenomenon, and Christians around the world are basically extensions of this. Now, this is obviously ridiculous because, you know, Roman Catholics have existed in Sri Lanka and in India for hundreds of years, and there's churches in India that are 2,000 years old, that go back to the very start of Christianity. But because the media generally is not very interested in religion as a topic to deeply investigate, they instead have to view the communities there through this lens of a Western trope. And it's, you know, that's factually wrong, but it also makes their analysis extremely bad. And because that analysis ultimately filters through to a way a lot of people make decisions, this creates, in the long run, pretty extensive damage.
I think this guy was momentarily possessed by the desire to be ratioed on Twitter.
Yeah.
So that's that. And then second is one of the ways that liberalism prevents radicalization in society is that they convince members of religions that they haven't been owned by liberalism.
Yeah.
And that
they're still religious.
Right. Because once people sort of understand the extent to which their fundamental religious beliefs and practices have been put in a certain box that has like 4 corners, and there's no spilling out of that box, right? There's just no way. And so the process of radicalization, as far as I've seen it,
is when people realize that they're being put in the box.
Is when people realize that they're in the box and they're like, oh my, like this is it.
I think you see the same thing with like Marxists, the degree of like Marxist LARPing and like people dressing up like they're like 60s activists or whatever.
Right.
Hey man, it's an aesthetic.
and like it's less about or they don't realize how much they've been recuperated by kind of like the dominant like ideological system or the dominant like economic system. I think if a lot of the like so-called Marxists on college campuses like understood the nature of the socio-economic superstructures in which they find themselves, they would be like way more cynical or else I don't know what would happen, but they I think they just wouldn't.
I think
keep
it would
acting that
look very different. Like you do see people who do take their analysis seriously, or do take their anti-capitalism seriously, or whatever, and they end up almost like ejected from the rest of the left, because the rest of the left is like everything else.
I mean, this is something that
well
struck me with like
recuperated.
the Zizek like Peterson debate, right? Is the extent to which like Zizek has been basically like kind of kicked out of most of his like politically correct like left.
Well, he's just I mean, he has enough thumos to be willing to say whatever's on his mind. Like he's just willing to say whatever at this point, and so he's willing to say certain things about Trump that get him in trouble. He's willing to say certain things about political correctness that get him in trouble.
But I mean, he's willing to call into into people's minds the fact that most of kind of the protest activity is just kind of filling this like outrage theater or whatever it is.
Yeah, well, this comes back to the Davos article, right, where we talk about recuperation, about how these protest movements are like kind of and we're applying it now to religions, but
constantly
how these protest movements, they're brought into the system as like a fake version of themselves that placates the people that were previously committed to them, but not quite paying attention.
Fundamental interests.
But no longer threatens any fundamental interests. And like this is happening all the time.
Yeah, and so to speak for a second to the strengths, right, of this like dominant ideology, like structure, it's like say what you will about all of the ways in which it's kind of like flawed and problematic and create and like the trajectory of it and how it's maybe like led to the destruction of certain institutions and everything, but it is extremely well adapted to kind of this inclusive diversity, whatever you want to call it. This kind of that's actually in a lot of ways, it's the trope that like diversity is our strength, but for liberalism that is actually the case. Like it's
better able to handle that situation than anything else.
The kind of minorities or fringe religions or whatever it is because of its diversity.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, and as the process of recuperation continues, once you start thinking of this phenomenon as recuperation, you can kind of start to predict the trajectory of the actual people involved in that intellectual process. So let me make a bold posit here and test my own religious literacy. To the extent that the current upcoming crop of let's call them liberal Muslim or reforming Muslim intellectuals are successful, within 3 generations from that point, they will cease to matter outside of their small localized institutions that they build for themselves. A lot like how the currents of liberal Catholicism that had become popular in the 1960s no longer really exercise influence outside of the Catholic academic context. I mean, I don't really know anyone who's going to Davos or interning for the United Nations who cares much about what a think tank at a Catholic university thinks the Catholic Church has to offer to the liberal order, when 2 generations ago this could actually garner a lot of interest.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Like they sort of, the first generation gets sort of like a seat at the table, but subsequently like the bargaining power just strictly decreases over time.
Yeah, you definitely see that with the Catholic. I mean, there are some of these like Catholic social thought initiatives at places like Georgetown, and I can't speak maybe in general, but at the few events that I've attended, it seems like they're very much just like kind of talking to themselves and kind of like it's very like literally kind of preaching to the choir in a lot of ways.
I mean, so potential threats are brought in under the process of recuperation, and if they don't make...
some of them are just outright crushed. Sure, of course, yeah. And if there's no active process by that group of ensuring coordination and succession over the long term, then they lose any kind of ability to matter. Yeah, well,
and so then there's no need for them to have a seat at the table. That's the issue.
This comes to one of my big like strategic posits in terms of like the strategy for any of these groups is like basically succession of your civilization system in a countercultural position is impossible. It's like flat out impossible to do succession to do a multi-generational, like embedded foreign civilization system unless you become something that fundamentally is like contained, like Judaism was in the Middle Ages, or you just totally dissolve into the surrounding structure. Like those are the two options, and neither of those is like any kind of actual strategy where you win. The only strategies where you win are ones where you actually like capture the state, because basically like within any empire you can only have one hegemon, and that hegemon is going to be pretty totalizing.
Well, and this debate has been quite live in religious communities.
Right.
Within the Catholic world, there was
you had the article on that.
The release a few years ago of Rod Ware's The Benedict Option, which tried to theorize that maybe Christians could build this counterculture in the same way that the monastics, continued Christian life and culture and transmitted knowledge in the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The key difference, of course, being that the central power in that case, first of all, was Christian at that point, and second was in collapse. And so there was not this hostility that exists between those communities and a central, strident and liberal power that wants to sublimate them.
Crucially, in that collapse, like to use Samo's empire theory terminology here a little bit, the Roman Empire collapse, as far as I know, was like a decentralized collapse where like pieces were sort of falling off the system and like the center was getting weaker and weaker. Whereas you can also get a centralized collapse where like on the way down, the center maintains control and it's able to just smash anything that's trying to do anything different, or like smash. Like, so it's able to like, the thing is almost collapsing because the center is like cannibalizing the parts of the thing, and so like, for anyone
Nazi Germany had elements of that,
right. Okay, sure. And so for anyone who might be like, oh, but we're sort of undergoing something of a collapse as well. I think ours is maybe more akin to, at least within the West itself, more akin to a centralized collapse.
I mean, I don't know. I think one of the hard things is to analyze these phenomena while you're inside of it, especially because of the time scale, right? And so that's where I'd kind of back up and try to kind of be more at a kind of a pragmatic, like ground level view of kind of the needs and the functions of kind of how people are satisfying their needs in society or not, and what role institutions are playing, because I think you can only really tell the big overarching kind of trend line stories in retrospect. And
in retrospect,
yeah,
like
it's hard to tell whether. But sometimes it's like hard to tell whether it's a 10-year or a 100-year.
Yeah, but I mean, like, cycle. Let's look at over like the last 100 years. Do we have breakaway communities within the like core West that are sustainable?
No.
It's like we had a bunch of counterculture in the 60s that tried it. We've had a bunch of religious things that tried it. None of them worked, right? And so that convinces me, like, okay, we're not in the condition where you can do breakaway stuff.
Which means we're probably at this kind of like this more universal hegemonic like stage of whatever the overarching civilization is.
Maybe the best candidate for that might have been the Mormon Church.
Yeah, but they did it in like the 19th century. Right.
And it didn't work.
And it's ultimately kind of now
they dropped polygamy from their official doctrine as part of a détente with the federal government, right?
Yeah.
Yes, and even now, to the extent that they do contradict, parts of the liberal worldview, while the Mormon Church doesn't really try to openly make itself a political object. Their public image is as responsible neighbors, and the most annoying thing they do is maybe knock on your door once in a while. They don't openly gun for the transformation of society.
And just run the CIA.
But the Mormons, going back to what I said before, are kind of the peak example of like, I'm an American just like you. Like I'm the next door neighbor.
I just happen to have 9 wives.
I mean, well, no, that's those would be like breakaway from.
Yeah, I guess that's
those ones do
that's
get
a much older-
persecuted.
Yeah, those ones really are kind of,
Yeah, those are like FLDS and
Yeah.
and various other Mormon splinter groups that are.
Yeah,
that are
in
like,
fact, Mormons went so American that they have an eschatological view of America that could even be comparable to the way that evangelicals view Israel, right?
That's-
And
yeah, that's
so
exactly
they
correct.
out-Americanist the Americans.
right.
I mean, the Constitution is practically a divine document.
Yep. So, and of course, most religious bodies, for either doctrinal or cultural or whatever reason, are never going to take that step. And even within America itself, that stance makes the Mormons, a bit strange, a bit out of the ordinary. But that signal is still something that's very confusing to what we could call the culture of the governing class in America.
Well, we could go on to discuss the Zizek-Peterson debate further, or we could talk about the Balkans article we just published earlier today. But I think, we're coming up on 2 hours, so we're going to cut it off here. This was an awesome discussion.
Yeah, now that we've pissed off everybody.
Yeah, I can just close with one observation.
Go ahead, Matt.
Which is that, there's this notion in geopolitics that there's nothing new under the sun. And I think in preparing for this podcast, I was thinking about, we're talking about trouble in the Balkans. We're talking about, the American power in the world and kind of the the Russian kind of turn towards orthodoxy to kind of as a kind of nationalistic tool. I mean, we could be having this discussion like 1913, and I think it would be very similar.
Yeah.
Like it would be very familiar to like the kind of the statesman of of the
like
day.
the Balkans article was just like very briefly. It's like, all right, well, here's how the Balkans could end up being a powder keg, and this small diplomatic thing could end up like turning into a very large diplomatic situation. It's like, have we seen this before from the Balkans?
Yeah, and so I think like it makes me in some ways, that's why I was happy to write this Hilger piece, because I think we have to kind of learn from our history, and everything that's old is kind of new again.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the fundamental sort of assumptions that we have to take here is like there's a lot of patterns that repeat over time and across space that and as you study these things in different contexts, you come to see the patterns themselves. And they're thus better able to actually predict what's going on. Yes,
Thesis, history is real.
History is real. History is real. I know we don't talk that much about history, but it is a very important thing to understand.
And with that, I think that's all about the time we have for this episode number 6. This has been the Palladium crew with Matt Ellison. Matt, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, guys.
And you can follow him at Matt G. Ellison on Twitter. You should do that.
And don't forget that he failed the water challenge.
And he did.
That's MG Ellison.
MG Ellison. And
I need thousands of people to get the right handle.
That's right. And he did fail the water challenge. And we'll leave it at that. And see you all next week.
All right, thanks everyone.